everyone, it's Alice, and today we're gonna take a look at everything I read in April. The first book that I have to talk about is Emma by Jane Austen, and as I'm sure you're all aware of, this is a classic romance novel, and in it we follow Emma Woodhouse, who is young, rich, and independent, and although she has decided for herself never to marry, she loves organizing her acquaintances' love affairs and basically getting into everybody's business, which throughout the book gets her into a fair bit of trouble. As I'm sure many of you know, I read this for my classics project, and so I did a whole vlog all about this book, and I did a fairly extensive review of it, so if you want more details, you're welcome to check that out. But yeah, I really enjoyed this book, and I'm really glad I finally got around to reading it. My favorite part of this book was probably reading about Emma and getting to know her. She's very high-spirited and independent, and she's a very interesting character. She is, in a lot of ways, very much a product of her own privilege, and I felt that throughout the book, a lot of her thoughts and views on things were challenged, and I just thought it was really interesting to see her through all of that and seeing her grow from it. There's a lot of drama in this book, which I very much enjoyed, and I loved seeing this little town and meeting all the people in it and seeing how their lives become entangled and just seeing them trying to figure everything out. And then Emma is sort of in the mix of all of this, and she sort of makes things very complicated, and it's interesting to see everyone trying to get out of that. And it is very much a book about life in a lot of ways, which I very much enjoyed. And obviously it is very well written because it is Jane Austen. My main complaint about this book, though, is the length and the pacing, which I don't love. I think it's a little bit too long, and there are parts in here that drag a little bit, and there is some stuff in here that is less interesting than the rest, if you will. And so there are like some parts in here between all the drama and all the characters and all of that, there are some parts that feel a little bit more like a chore to get through. It was definitely overall very enjoyable though, and very well worth the read, which is not surprising. And it's my second favorite Jane Austen that I've read, right after Pride and Prejudice, so I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. The second book that I read in April was less of a success for me though, not gonna lie. I read Vox by Christina Dolcher, and this is a dystopian novel, and in it we meet this woman who lives in a country where women are not allowed to say more than 100 words a day, and all of them have to wear this like bracelet that will give them an electric shock if they surpass the 100 words. And in this country, young girls are no longer taught to read and write, and they're basically like raised to be homemakers. And this woman that we meet is a mother, and one day the government comes to her and asks her for help, and she sort of sees this as an opportunity to do something about this whole issue. I had heard very mixed things about this book before going into it, so I knew to be a little bit apprehensive, but I just thought the premise of the story sounded so interesting that I wanted to give it a go anyway, and so I did, and honestly, this just wasn't that good. I still think the concept of the story is excellent, and I do like the way it discusses the importance of language and the importance of having a voice. And I do generally find dystopian stories like these really interesting because they do discuss really interesting things. For me, this did actually start off fairly well, and I was reading it and I was like thinking to myself, well, this isn't half bad. And then I kept going, and I do think that we have an interesting story in here and an interesting concept, like I said, with not great characters, but also not the worst. And so in the beginning I was like, well, this might turn out to be like a fairly okay / good story. And then I just kept going, and it just completely lost me. It just started going downhill at some point, and it did not stop going until we got to the end, which was so confusing and messy and all over the place, and it just did not work for me. I do really feel like this started off as an average read for me, and then it just ended up not being a very good one. And the ending really tipped the scale for me, like it just completely lost itself. And maybe I'm being a little bit harsh, but I can't help but compare this to other dystopian novels that I've read. I love dystopian novels, and I've read some really, really good ones, and this just doesn't compare at all. So I was a little bit disappointed, and yeah, it was just not that great for me. So I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. I am maybe being a little bit extra harsh on this because I do still feel like the concept of the story is so good and it could have done so much, and I think that it could have been great. And so maybe I'm a little bit more disappointed than usual, which is surprising seeing as I've read very mixed things, but I still feel like so much could be done with that premise, and then this is what we got, and it was just not that great. Second to last, I read Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow, and this is a non-fiction book, and also, I guess you could call it true crime. And in it, Farrow, who is a journalist, tells us about his experience of working on the Harvey Weinstein case and how incredibly difficult it was to get that out into the press. And it really takes a look at how these women who came forward were threatened and suppressed and silenced, and how this whole industry and this whole culture protected a predator. And it's all about how difficult it was to bring him into the light for everyone to see. So this is, for me, a little bit of a difficult book to review because I think that the story in here is so important. And this is a really comprehensive look at it, and we really, like, at least me, I learned a lot about this case that I didn't know, and it really takes us thoroughly through like the whole timeline and all of the stuff that happened. And yet, I did struggle with this a little bit. I think that this would be a very interesting read for most people. It's a very comprehensive look at this case, and you get to read about stuff that you maybe have heard about, but you get to learn more about it. You get to learn about stuff that you probably don't know. And then there's stuff in here that you thought you knew, and then you realize that you haven't understood the full extent of it. Like the lengths that were gone to silence these women is absolutely unbelievable. Like I knew that that had happened, but I didn't understand how bad it really was. I also think it's important that the voices of these women are heard and known, and I think the book does a really good job of shining a light on the systematic oppression of these survivors and just how incredibly difficult it was for them and how difficult it is in general, even when you don't have this like super powerful person literally trying to just like crush you. What I struggled with a bit though was the writing and the structure of it, and I don't know if the disconnect I felt was because this was maybe written for an American audience, but there was something in here that just like didn't quite work for me. Like I felt like the writing and the pace of it was kind of like disjointed sometimes and a little bit jumpy in a way. And I think that I thought this was going to be a different kind of book, and I didn't realize how much the journalists part of it was going to feature in this book. I thought that it was going to focus more on the women and their stories, and I guess I don't know how else it could have been done, but I just felt like there was a lot about the journalists, and obviously that's an important part of the story too, but there was just more of it than I had expected. And I also felt like that part of it got a little bit repetitive, which I do realize like that's what happened, but I don't know, it was just structured in a little bit of a different way than I had expected, and there was something about it that didn't quite like work for me for whatever reason. I was just a little bit surprised, and maybe this is my own fault for not like reading the blurb or not getting this from the blurb, but the author of this featured a lot more in the story than I thought he was going to, and I didn't know about his story and everything that happened to him, and obviously that's important as well, but there was just a lot more about him and his experience of this thing that I had expected, and I don't really know, I think this went in a slightly different direction than I had expected, and it was a lot less focused than I had thought it was going to be. I also, and this might be entirely me, but I got really confused with all the names in here. There are so many people in this book, and I felt like because there are so many people, whenever someone is just like brought up and it's just a name, I don't know how to connect that person to the story. And maybe again, because I'm not American, I don't know who all of these people are. I just got a little bit confused, and I think that that could have been solved by just like having a little thing in the front or the back of the book that just like had names and how people were connected to this or what they did for a living or whatever. I think that that would have been very helpful for me because I kept like getting pulled out of the book trying to figure out like who people were and where they were placed in the story. I don't know if my explanation of how I felt about this book is really making a whole lot of sense, but I am really, really glad that I read this book. It is a horrifying and also fascinating case, and it's one of those cases where you look at it at its surface and it's horrible, but then you take a closer look at it and it's even worse. Like, it's so bad, and I think it's a very important story to know about. And I'm really glad I read it. There was just some parts of the writing and stuff that didn't quite work for me. So I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. I still think that the importance of the story outshines everything else with this. So I would still recommend it, but yeah, horrifying, horrifying case, and something that I think we all need to know. Moving on to the last book that I read, though, we have Bunny by Mona Awad. And this is contemporary literary fiction with a little bit of horror in it, I guess. And the story is about this woman who is attending this highly selective, prestigious writing program. And in her class, there's this clique of other women who are rich and unbearable and obsessed with each other, and they call each other Bunny, and she hates them. But then she gets an invitation to attend one of their events, and down the rabbit hole she goes. This is a super weird book, which I knew going into this, and with books like these, I feel like it can go both ways, but I ended up really enjoying this. It is the kind of book that's really difficult to talk about, though, because I feel like this is one of those books that needs to be experienced. I felt really sucked into this though, and for a lot of it, you're just sort of like really in it and you're watching everything that's happening and you don't really understand it, but at the same time, it's somehow like really fascinating. It has a very dreamlike quality to it, the story, which every once in a while will like slip into a nightmare, but then it sort of gets back to that dreamlike quality, and you never really know what's coming, and that makes this book kind of like tense, but in the best way. I really like the writing in here as well. I felt like it really brought to life everything, like the characters and the setting and everything that happens, and it just brings life to both the mundane and also the odd, of which there is a lot of in this book. I would call this a unique and bizarre book, and it's definitely not for everyone. I don't really know who I would recommend this to, but if you're the kind of person who wants like everything to make sense and you don't like confusing things and you want things to have like meaning, this is probably not the book for you. But if you like really weird books and you don't need to understand everything that's going on, and you're the kind of reader that can just like go in and be along for the ride, however odd it is, I think you might like this. It is interesting that I like this book though, because usually I don't like confusing books and I don't like when things are vague, but for some reason it just really worked for me in this, and I really, really liked it, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Okay everyone, those are all the books that I had to talk about, and now I would love to hear what you read in April, and also if you've ever read any of the books that I read this month, I would love to hear your thoughts about them. Maybe especially Bunny. Even if you didn't like it, I would love to just hear what you thought. It's one of those books that I feel really splits opinions, and it's a very interesting book to discuss. So let me know if you read that book, what you thought, and also what else you've been reading lately. And as usual, links to my Patreon and other social media will be in the description if you're interested, and I will see you soon. Bye!